Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the architecture section of the course AR 309. It is the lecture number 6. In today's lecture, we will continue to learn about the major influences on architectural design and construction. So let's move on to our very first slide. Climatic influence on architecture. Definition of climate. Climate is the average weather in a given area. It is the composite or generally prevailing weather conditions of a region such as temperature, air pressure, humidity, sunshine, cloudiness, and winds throughout the year. Climate is one of the important factors which affect architecture. We cannot just draw architectural plans and building forms without considering the climate of that particular area. The comparison of climatic data and the requirements for thermal comfort provide the basis for the selection of building design and construction respectively. In architecture, climate influences may affect the orientation of the building, space planning, structure, materials, type of the roof and external treatment of the building, and they all can be adequately selected to develop the desired internal environment. Moving on to the next slide. Before knowing about the climatic influences on architecture, we must learn the classification of different climatic zones based on their geographic locations. Number one is the tropical zone. Climatic conditions in the tropical zones are characterized by monthly average temperature of 18 degrees Celsius or higher year-round and features hot temperature. There are normally only two seasons in tropical climates, a wet season and a dry season. The annual temperature range in the tropical climates is normally very small and the sunlight is very intense there. In this region are mostly the countries of the so-called Third World such as British Malaysia, West, East and South Africa, generally greater part of Africa, Middle East, South and East India, Singapore, Palestine, Japan, Brazil, North Australia, etc. According to the architectural recommendations, the tropical zone implies a necessity for shelter against the rain or moisture, heat and sun. Moreover, it needs good airing and cooling capacity of a house. Number second are the subtropical zone, the climatic conditions. A humid subtropical climate is a zone of climate characterized by hot and humid summers and cold to mild winters. There are three climatic types in subtropical group: tropical wet, tropical monsoon, and tropical wet and dry. Places with a tropical wet climate are also known as rainforest. These equatorial regions have the most predictable weather on the earth, with warm temperature and regular rainfall. Temperatures are high. The warmest months generally have an average temperature about 27 degrees Celsius, with mean daily maxima from 30 degrees Celsius to 38 degrees Celsius, and with warm oppressive nights. Examples are the Los Angeles, California, Sydney and Perth in Australia, Cape Town, South Africa, Argentina, Gobi Desert in China, and most of the regions of Iran, Pakistan, Greece, etc. According to the architectural recommendation, the subtropical zone needs shelter against too much sun and too much cooling. The temperate zone. Climatic conditions. Temperate climates are generally defined as environments with moderate rainfall spread across the year or portion of the year, with mild to warm summers and cool to cold winters. These climate zones are so dry because moisture is rapidly evaporated from the air and there is very little precipitation. In this zone, there are typically warm and humid summers with thunderstorms and mild winters, with an average monthly temperature above 10 degrees Celsius in the warmest months and above minus 3 degrees Celsius in their colder months. This climatic region includes typical of Europe, other includes some of the areas in North America South Africa, South Australia, New Zealand, China, etc. According to the architectural recommendations, the temperate zone requires shelter against the rain and snow, alternately shelter against cold and against the heat, and orientation will be towards the sun. Number 4, the dry zone, climatic conditions. Regions lying within the dry climate group occur where precipitation is low. There are two dry climate types, arid and semi-arid. Most arid climate receives 10 to 30 centimeters of rain each year, and semi-arid climate receive enough to support their extensive grasslands. Desert area can approach 40 degrees Celsius or more, and in some areas winters when low can drop well below freezing. This zone stretches through other main zones. It is principally the desert areas and steppes, for example, in Iraq and Egypt. According to the architectural recommendation, the dry zone needs shelter against sand, dust, and rot. In most cases, also against too much sun or heat. Number 5 is the Arctic and subarctic zone. Climatic conditions. The climate of the Arctic is characterized by long cold winters and short cool summers. The Arctic consists of ocean that is largely surrounded by the land. As such, the climate of much of the Arctic is moderated by the ocean water, which can never have a temperature below -2 degrees Celsius. This is typical of Siberia and Alaska. Another example is the northern part of Scandinavia. According to the architectural recommendation, the Arctic and subarctic requires shelter against cold and wind and seriously in the need of heat and sun. All the regions can be seen on the map provided on the slide. Starting from the middle of the Earth, called as equator, the climatic condition varies as it reaches to either direction, which is the north or the south. Moving on to the next slide. How does the climate influence the architecture and construction? In what way does the climate influence a building? Of course, this does not happen directly. The building is for a man, and it is essentially important for a man to adapt himself to his natural surroundings or to defend himself against them. We may then ask the question, how does the climate influence human and how? Simply by heat and cold, by wind and air, by rain or moisture and fog, etc. And then we can help ourselves by developing a suitable architecture to prevent us from harsh weather. Moving on to our next slide. There are different building designs according to the different climatic zones, and we shall expect to see differences in the general pattern of buildings in different regions. For instance, in the tropical and subtropical countries, here the houses needs roof in form of umbrella, and the use of large shades to prevent from sunlight are common, but open for air access as well. Its wall have to resolve onto fences and air screens. Thus, the man seeks shade and airy places, shelter against the moisture and fever, and above all, refreshments. Some examples of modern houses at tropical regions can be seen on the left side of the slide. However, subtropical zones usually have mixed housing, with most of them are made up of RCC, while on the right side, the picture just appeared is a section of a house in the tropical and subtropical zones. It is showing the architectural mechanism for air transfer and prevention from the sunlight. Moving on to the next slide, the temperate zone. The houses in temperate zone are usually open to the sun and sheltered against the rain, gives a full view of the winter landscape and yet shelter against the cold. The houses have different summer, southern and northern side treated accordingly. Few are some houses designed in temperate zone, and below them is the demonstration of architectural design mechanics to absorb the heat in the winters and circulate the winds in the summer. Moving on to the next slide, houses in the dry zone. The houses look inward, isolating itself from the outer world, creating a clear, cool, shaded inner area, where a sheltered artificial garden and a sacred water fountain or a pond are never missing elements. Few are some examples of a modern architecture constructed in the dry regions with one house having a spiritual white color just to reflect the heat rays in the summers. Let's move on to the next slide. In the Arctic and subarctic zone, in this area we have rooms and houses or well insulated and sheltered small rooms. For example, the tent of Samoyed, located at the north of Siberia, as shown on the left side of the slide, and on the right side is the earth hut of the Laplander, located in the extreme north of Scandinavia. These forms usually have half globes with conical and cylindrical shapes, for example igloo for Eskimos. The sun circles nearly horizontally around the houses, and there is a barricade only against one condition, which is against the wind. Here mans or humans guard warmth or heat, looks to make the most out of the day and sunlight, defend themselves against the wind, and avoid all the movements in the winter. Moreover, in considering the area to be developed, the site climate will be affected by other factors as well, such as ground cover, slope, orientation, elevation of the site, the nature of the terrain surrounding the sites, water level below the ground, and the length of the time convenient to build in a open surface. It should be emphasized that the table concentrates on the basic climatic data, omitting other aspects such as floor materials, internal finishes, choice of colors, cost and social custom, etc., which are also the other important factors in making the design decisions. Moving on to the next slide. Types of foundation in different climatic regions. The foundation of buildings bear on and transmit loads to the ground, but on the other hand, it also acts as an insulation of building from harmful earth properties such as dampness and moisture. Similarly, act as a barrier against the harsh climatic conditions. Each type of the foundation is widely varied and all are depending upon the climate, nature of the soil and topography. The following are the general indicators as the foundation type depends to a great extent on the climate and soil. A. In the cold region, the foundation is better to be raised off the ground level. This is necessary with respect to the fact that the soil is ever frozen in this area. Pile foundation on the top of the ground are desirable with the floors additionally insulated. The foundation must be isolated from the rest of the building to avoid the heat transfer from the inner living space to the ground. An excessive load on the pile foundation should also be avoided. The picture on the left top of the slide is an example of the foundation in the cold regions. Secondly, in the temperate regions, the depth of the foundation is usually below the ice level and also can be visualized on the picture below. Number third is in the hot humid tropics, the foundation is supposed to be raised off the ground level and adequately treated for the protecting against insect and dampness. Pile foundations are often used where there is occurrence of tropical terra rosa, which is the humus red soil and can be seen in the picture on the right top of the slide. These pile foundation may in some cases extend it over to the 100 meters of depth. And the last is in the hot and dry regions, the subsoil temperature is almost stable with an average of 28 degrees Celsius at the depth of 1 meter and 21 degrees Celsius at the 4-meter depth below the ground surface in the summer, while in winter it is above 14 degrees Celsius at 1 meter depth and 21 degrees Celsius at the level of 4 meter below the ground. Considering this fact, the subsoil temperature is lower than the air temperature in summer. It is necessary for the building to have direct contact with the soil. The two sides of the surface layers of the foundation are supposed to be insulated to save the floor from the heat transfer. Finally, it should be pointed out that among the various conditions responsible for the human safety in the building, the first consideration goes to the stability of the building, and it is the responsibility of an engineer to identify the geographical and climatic conditions of that particular area prior to select the type of foundation. Moving on to the next slide, social influence on architecture. Buildings are eternally connected with humans and significantly reflects the socio-economic standard of a society. Thus, buildings essentially are social and cultural products and are influenced by the ideas, values, beliefs, activities, relationships, and form of the social organization that a society sustains. Society produces buildings, and the buildings, although not produce a society, and help to maintain many of its social forms. But don't you sometimes wonder that maybe our physical environment influences the way we live together and our behavior in different social situations or places such as housing, work, school, healthcare or hospitals and became influenced by the society and its organization as well as by human lifestyles. People make places in which they do things to live, such as places to eat, to sleep, to shop, to worship, to learn, and so on. The way in which they organize their places is related to their beliefs, their aspirations, and their worldviews. As worldviews may vary, so does the architecture at the personal level, at the social level, and at the cultural level. And between different subcultures within a society, if you can understand how a person relates to the world, you can understand how to design the for that person, and perhaps even judge less, considering that all worldviews are valid, mainly since they are so strongly related to the variety of factors to which a certain individual is exposed. Moving on to our next slide, architecture contrasts in different social societies. Since it is more than obvious that buildings and the entire built environment are essentially social and cultural products, buildings result from social needs and accommodate a variety of functions such as social, political, economic, religious, and cultural. Their size, appearance, location, and forms are governed not simply by the physical factors but by a society's lifestyle, its forms of economic and social organization, its distribution of resources and authority, its activities, and the beliefs and values which they prevail at any one period of time. An example of architectural contrast based on socio-economic and cultural differences is presented on this slide to get the better understanding. On the left side it is the Times Square, and on the right side it is the city of Africa. As changes in the society occur, so too does the change in its built environment. New building types emerge as old ones become obsolete. Some buildings are then modified, extended, and take on different functions. Others may just simply disappear. Moving on to our next slide, social disharmony and architecture mismatch. Social disharmony refers to the settlement of various social practices into a unite place. Social practices may vary as people of different religious beliefs or having different economic status or different culture are residing adjacent to each other or in the same society. Such social disharmony can generate the architectural mismatch based on their social contrast. This may disturb the harmonized appearance of the society and can significantly disvalue the social setup. Another example are the slum settlement that can be easily located adjacent to a well-developed societies. There are few more pictures are displayed on this slide which are referring the social disharmony and architectural mismatch. As a conclusion, if we want to understand buildings and environment, we must understand the society and culture in which they exist. This will not only help to contribute the social development and also explore the unique new ideas for designing and construction. Furthermore, generating design patterns for environmental and social behavior variety can also contribute to understand the importance of sociology and architecture in particular. So this sums up the social influence on architecture. Let's move on to our last major influence, historical influence on architecture. Ancient architecture has always influenced the architects and engineers by mixing old concept of building designs with new materials, ideas and technology. And as a result, whole new designs are brought forward in the modern era as architectural works are visible as cultural, political and religious symbols. Ancient civilizations are often known as fundamental or patents through their architectural achievements and discoveries. Therefore, cities, regions, and cultures continue to identify themselves through the art and architecture and are known by their architectural monuments. Architectural revivals arises to reflect an older tradition, to show the association with the past and renowned tradition of our ancestors. Architecture is one of the proof of development of human civilization that has changed or evolved according to their circumstances and cultural desires throughout the time. The development of human civilization cannot be separated from the development of culture. In other words, architecture which is born in one place is a cultural manifestation in that place and reflection of human lifestyle as well. Along with that, the development of architecture is also filled with the influences which come into the specific region or an area and give different shapes so that an architecture is developed and which is different from the other places. This influence will not necessarily be present, but it is a product that has appeared after a continuous and long process of mankind evolution. It is us that have driven the change and simultaneously things around us evolved according to our desires and living standards. And architecture is one of them. Modern architecture has grown and developed from centuries of innovation and inventions from past civilizations. As historic architecture was greatly influenced by religion, and the religious practices remain the same as compared with the social and cultural culture. Therefore, most of the religious buildings are still utilizing the classic architectural styles and identities to construct the important religious buildings with few modifications. Moving on to the next slide, prehistoric influence on modern architecture. Though not much prehistoric architecture has survived into this modern era, there is no denying that mankind's first attempt to manipulate their surroundings has heavily influenced the architecture throughout the centuries. It's hard to imagine how humans viewed the world over 10,000 years ago, but even then, before there was even a writing system to record their efforts, prehistoric man constructed the stone circles, which are known as megaliths, and structures which are visible in the slide, that still confuse the archaeologists to this day. The very limited scope of prehistoric architecture mainly centers on geometric forms, possibly drawing the inspiration from the most influential and sacred form around them. the sun and the moon. Circular shapes are at the heart of the most of the prehistoric mans and architecture that has been uncovered, including simple circular earth mounds to the layout of the monolithic Stonehenge as shown in the picture. Above all, the prehistoric times are considered as the foundation of architecture and engineering, and all origin of shelter concept to run a society, as someone has to start someday. Moving on to our next slide. Egyptian civilization influence on modern architecture. Though there were other civilizations that were emerging and developing their own architecture style around a similar time, such as Sumerians in Mesopotamia and Persia. It was the ancient Egyptian who had the biggest influence on modern architecture, as well as creating one of the first world written languages and a society of religion and dynastic ruling class. Ancient Egyptians used their unparalleled resources to create a structure on a scale that have never seen before. The Egyptian architecture were not only very complex, as Egyptian pyramid used post and lintel technique and system of distributing weight distribution system that allowed the construction of massive monumental palaces and tombs, and are still the iconic structures thousand year later in the modern times. The picture visible on the right side of the slide is displaying the phenomena for dragging massive stone through the weight distribution system. In addition to the size of their structures, ancient Egyptian architects were among the first to employ materials such as stone, a fact that greatly influenced later by Greek architecture and of course remains popular today. The picture on the right side of the slide has the glass pyramid at the Louvre Museum in Paris is just one example of the Egyptian influence in modern times. Moving on to our next slide, Greek architecture influence on modern times. Greek architecture was the start of what is referred to the classical period of architecture, which shaped the way we approach to architecture and construction in Western colonies around the world. To this day, Greek architecture's biggest influence on modern architecture was its creation of set of standardized rules. This led to an aesthetically pleasing uniformity throughout ancient Greece, which was later adopted by the Roman architecture. Greek architecture had three main styles of column decoration, then later merges with the Roman designs. They include Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. These beautification of column became amazingly popular in classic architecture period, and ornamented columns along with the use of human sculptures become the prominent way for decorating the building facade, as displayed in the picture. And it was the first time in the history that building facade gained so much attention. Moving on to our next slide, Roman architecture influence in modern times. There are many ways in which Roman architecture influenced modern architecture, and though Roman architects borrowed heavily from earlier Greek styles, their buildings were more highly ornamented and they developed numerous concepts that were very foundation of modern architecture and engineering. The innovations in architecture developed by Romans were often prompted by the needs of an ever-expanding empire. Few civilizations have ever created an empire on this size and scale as compared with the Romans, thus prompted a need for creative thinking process by city planners and architects of that time. Roads, aqueducts, and sewer systems were all invented in order to fulfill the needs of the expanding Roman Empire, and without them a modern society could not function. There was also a need for the Roman state to impress, entertain, and cater to their growing population, all within relatively confined urban areas. So, in addition to roads, water, and sewers, the public required stadiums and religious temples to keep them entertained. This, together with the Rome's growing desire to increase its power and majesty throughout Italy and beyond, they further required public buildings to be imposing on large scale and highly functional. Other Roman masterpieces include amphitheatre, use of arches, monuments, and bathhouses, and they are all visible on this slide. Moving on to our next slide, Byzantine influence on modern architecture. As many prominent architects moved from Italy to the new capital of the Roman Empire, Byzantium, now known as the Istanbul in Turkey, Roman architecture evolved into something new. The growing influence of Christianity had a significant influence on Byzantine architecture, especially in the way in which religious spaces were decorated. During the Byzantine period, Christian art was only allowed to be displayed, theoretically claiming a more modest appreciation of religious divinity rather than the human forms. Therefore, iconography developed in a highly stylized manner in order to make the teachings of Christianity easily accessible, even to those who could not read. And this led to a new decorative method such as mosaic made from the glass rather than stone, gliding murals and relief sculptures. The style, use of color, technique, and use of materials have heavily influenced in all manners of modern civilization. From internal decoration style to the icons of the top of your screen, during during Byzantine period, building interiors increasingly become the center of attention and thus highly decorated. Such practices have greatly influenced on religious architecture and can easily be found today. So this sums up the major influences that act upon the architecture and construction. Thank you so much for your attention. And the next lecture will be about the principle of architecture. So that's all. Allah Hafiz.